Have you ever stopped to wonder what truly happens when the person who always insisted on being in control suddenly wakes up to the realization that they are no longer pulling any of the strings? What occurs when the individual who carried themselves as someone untouchable, deeply confident, and completely unaffected is suddenly faced with a reality they never prepared for? What you are about to hear may fundamentally change the way you perceive and understand narcissistic behavior. The loss of control is frequently one of the most psychologically destabilizing experiences for a narcissistic person, because control is not merely something they happen to enjoy. It is something they rely on to maintain their entire sense of security and their internal feeling of self-worth. In many relationships, they become accustomed to knowing exactly how the other person will respond to them. They develop a firm expectation of access, attention, emotional reactions, forgiveness, and continued availability. Over time, this predictability creates a profound feeling of power. They begin to harbor the belief that no matter what happens or what choices they make, the other person will remain emotionally connected and within easy reach. When someone finally decides to walk away and manages to maintain strong, clear boundaries, that sense of certainty suddenly dissolves. The narcissistic individual can no longer predict what that person is thinking, feeling, or doing. They lose the ability to influence conversations, trigger specific emotional reactions, or shape the narrative of the relationship to suit their needs. This loss of influence creates an intense, gnawing discomfort because it removes a primary source of psychological stability that they may have depended on for years. What makes this transition especially difficult is that the narcissist often interprets independence as a direct personal threat rather than viewing it as a healthy and normal part of human relationships. The moment the former partner becomes emotionally unavailable, starts making independent decisions, and no longer seeks their approval, the narcissist is confronted with a reality they struggle to accept. They are forced to face the fact that they are no longer the center of that person's emotional world. This realization can trigger a cascade of frustration, anger, anxiety, obsessive thinking, and repeated desperate attempts to regain contact or reestablish their lost influence. The distress they feel is frequently less about the loss of love and more about the loss of their ability to control access, attention, and the emotional outcomes of the situation. When that control finally disappears, it exposes deep insecurities and fears that had previously remained hidden beneath a carefully maintained mask of superiority. The narcissistic identity is often heavily dependent on external validation because their sense of self is not as stable or internally grounded as it may appear to the outside observer. While they may project an image of confidence, certainty, and self-assurance to the world around them, much of that image is frequently maintained through the reactions of other people. Praise, admiration, attention, recognition, and even heated emotional responses serve as the evidence they need to feel important, desirable, powerful, or superior. Rather than generating a consistent, healthy sense of worth from within themselves, They often rely on others to reinforce that belief repeatedly. This dependence on validation can affect nearly every area of their daily lives. In their romantic relationships, they may constantly seek reassurance, admiration, or total emotional investment from their partners. In social or professional settings, they may become hyper-focused on status, physical appearance, achievements, or the specific impressions they create. Even criticism that might seem minor to other people can feel disproportionately threatening to them because it directly challenges the idealized image they work so hard to maintain. Positive attention strengthens that image, while rejection, indifference, or a sudden loss of admiration can create significant, agonizing emotional discomfort. When a person who once provided that steady stream of validation finally steps away, the narcissist may experience much more than just the end of a relationship. They may feel as though they have lost a vital source of psychological reinforcement that helped prop up their entire self-image. Suddenly, the compliments, the attention, the emotional reactions, and the constant availability they once counted on are no longer guaranteed. This can create a vacuum filled with intense feelings of insecurity, anxiety, frustration, or even deep-seated obsession. They may search frantically for new sources of validation, attempt to regain access to old ones, or become completely preoccupied with proving their value to others. The deeper issue here is not simply a desire for attention. It is a fundamental reliance on external approval to maintain a sense of identity, significance, and emotional stability in the face of underlying, persistent self-doubt. Applying a no-contact rule creates immense psychological pressure because it removes the very channels through which a narcissistic person typically maintains a sense of influence, awareness, and emotional control. In many relationships, they become accustomed to having unfettered access to the other person's thoughts, feelings, reactions, and daily life. Whether through direct communication, social media, mutual friends, or ongoing conflict, these connections provide the information and reassurance they need to feel that they still occupy an important place in that person's world. Even negative reactions can serve a specific purpose because they confirm that an emotional connection still exists. When no contact is established and consistently maintained, that flow of information suddenly stops. The narcissist no longer has any idea what the other person is doing, who they are spending time with, how they feel, or whether they are even thinking about the relationship at all. This uncertainty can become deeply uncomfortable because it creates a total loss of predictability. The individual who once seemed fully accessible becomes psychologically out of reach, and that lack of access often generates a growing sense of curiosity mixed with mounting frustration. The pressure continues to grow because the silence leaves ample room for unanswered questions. Without direct communication, the narcissist cannot easily test their influence, seek the reassurance they crave, defend their public image, or shape the narrative to fit their perspective. They may begin wondering if they have been forgotten, replaced, or permanently removed from that person's life altogether. The absence of any feedback can feel significantly more threatening than direct rejection because there is nothing concrete for them to respond to or challenge. As a result, no contact often forces them to sit with a level of uncertainty that they would normally move mountains to avoid. The inability to monitor, manipulate, persuade, or provoke a response can trigger a spike in anxiety, anger, obsessive thinking, and repeated attempts to regain access. The psychological pressure comes from losing both information and influence at the same time, leaving them completely unable to restore the familiar dynamics that once provided them with a sense of control. The ego begins to fracture when the carefully constructed image that a narcissistic person has created can no longer be consistently supported by the external reality of their environment. Much of their psychological stability depends on maintaining a fragile, often unshakable belief that they are truly exceptional, deeply desirable, highly important, or in total control of their surroundings. This self-image often acts as a protective, rigid shield against deeper, more painful feelings of inadequacy, hidden insecurity, lingering shame, or vulnerability. As long as they continue receiving validation, admiration, attention, or compliance from the people around them, that shield remains intact, and their underlying doubts stay largely hidden from themselves and others. However, when a significant source of validation is removed, especially after someone walks away and refuses to re-engage, cracks can begin to appear in that protective structure. The narcissist may start encountering undeniable evidence that challenges their core assumptions about themselves. The person they expected to return does not come back. The individual they believed truly needed them continues moving forward independently, thriving without them in the picture. The influence they once relied upon so heavily becomes less effective or disappears entirely. These experiences create a sharp, painful conflict between the image they hold of themselves and the reality unfolding around them. This internal conflict can be deeply unsettling because it forces them to confront difficult questions they normally spend their lives avoiding. If they are as powerful as they believed, why can they no longer control the situation? If they are as unforgettable as they imagined, why is someone else thriving without them? These questions can trigger intense discomfort because they threaten the grandiose self-perception that helps them feel secure. As the pressure continues to mount, their emotional reactions often become stronger and more erratic. Mood swings, defensiveness, irritability, obsessive thinking, and a heightened sensitivity to any form of criticism may begin to emerge. The individual may try much harder to seek new validation, rewrite the story of what happened, blame others for their circumstances, or find new ways to regain control. Beneath these outward behaviors lies an increasing, desperate struggle to keep their idealized self-image intact, while evidence continues to challenge it, eventually exposing the very vulnerabilities they have spent years trying to keep hidden. If this discussion is helping you piece together what happened in your own experience, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps more people find the information they need to protect themselves from unhealthy relationship dynamics and gives this community a better chance to grow and support others. Obsession eventually replaces certainty. When a narcissistic person loses the core confidence that they still hold influence over someone they once believed would always remain emotionally available to them. During the relationship, they may have felt perfectly secure in the assumption that they understood the other person's feelings, reactions, and future behavior down to the smallest detail. They often walk through life with the expectation that no matter how much distance is created or how much time passes, they will still occupy a significant, permanent place in that person's mind and heart. When that illusion is shattered, the reality of the loss is a shock that can be difficult for them to process or recover from. This certainty provides them with a profound sense of control and predictability that helps bolster their entire self-image. When that certainty vanishes, it leaves behind a hollow psychological void. The person who walked away is no longer responding, explaining, defending, or providing any kind of emotional feedback. Instead of receiving the constant confirmation that they still matter, the narcissist is left to grapple with a barrage of unanswered questions. They may start wondering what the other person is thinking, whether they have truly moved on, if someone else has taken their place, or if they are even being remembered at all. This lack of information can become increasingly difficult for them to tolerate. As a result, intrusive thoughts about their former partner may become much more frequent. The narcissist might begin to replay old conversations, revisit specific memories, analyze past events in detail, or search for hidden clues that could explain what went wrong. They might resort to monitoring social media, asking mutual acquaintances for updates, or creating elaborate scenarios in their mind just to fill the empty gaps left by uncertainty. What was once a position of confidence gradually turns into a state of intense, consuming preoccupation. This obsession is not necessarily driven by genuine love, emotional intimacy, or authentic concern. More often than not, it is fueled by the raw discomfort of simply not knowing. Human beings are naturally wired to seek closure and understanding. But for an individual who relies so heavily on control, uncertainty can feel especially threatening. The inability to predict, influence, or gain access to the other person's inner world transforms their former confidence into a rigid fixation, creating a cycle of rumination that becomes increasingly difficult to escape. Oftentimes, seeking a replacement source of validation fails because a new relationship cannot automatically solve the deep-rooted emotional and psychological issues that existed long before the previous relationship came to an end. Many people mistakenly assume that when a narcissistic person quickly moves on to someone new, it must mean they have fully recovered, forgotten the past, or found something much better. In reality, the new relationship frequently serves as nothing more than a temporary patch for their validation needs, rather than a genuine resolution of their deeper insecurities. At the very beginning, a new partner may provide plenty of admiration, attention, excitement, and emotional investment. This can create a powerful sense of relief for the narcissist because it restores many of the specific elements they feel they have lost. The attention reassures them that they are still desirable. The admiration supports their carefully crafted self-image, and the novelty acts as a distraction from lingering feelings of rejection, loss, or uncertainty. For a short period, this can make it appear to the outside world as though everything is perfectly fine. However, the underlying psychological needs that were present long before remain completely unchanged. The need for constant validation, the overwhelming fear of losing control, the extreme sensitivity to criticism, and the desperate dependence on external approval do not simply vanish just because a new person has entered the picture. As the relationship begins to feel more familiar and the initial rush of excitement inevitably fades, the new partner starts to be seen as a real human being rather than an idealized source of admiration. Differences naturally emerge, expectations begin to develop, and human imperfections become clearly visible. When this happens, the same insecurities that plagued their previous relationships will almost certainly resurface. The narcissist may start seeking more attention, become deeply dissatisfied, or feel threatened the moment the new partner stops providing a constant stream of endless validation. The replacement was expected to eliminate their internal discomfort, but because it only addresses the surface symptoms rather than the root causes, the sense of relief is often fleeting. The unresolved emotional vulnerabilities remain hidden beneath the surface, just waiting to reappear the moment the new source of validation no longer feels sufficient. Anger and desperation can grow together because both emotions often emerge from the very same source: the total loss of control, validation, and certainty. When a narcissistic person realizes that someone they once influenced is no longer responding in their expected, predictable ways, they may experience a powerful and overwhelming sense of frustration. This anger stems from the simple fact that their current reality is no longer matching their rigid expectations. The desperation, meanwhile, comes from the growing, gnawing awareness that their usual methods of regaining influence are simply not working. These two distinct emotional states can exist simultaneously, creating a very confusing and often intense pattern of behavior. The anger is frequently directed outward. They might blame the former partner, criticize them harshly, spread negative narratives to others, or portray themselves as the misunderstood victim. This reaction serves to protect their fragile self-image because it effectively shifts the responsibility away from themselves and onto someone else. Admitting that another person has actually chosen to move forward independently can be incredibly difficult for them because it strikes at the core of their belief in their own unique importance and influence. At the same time, a sense of desperation may be operating beneath the surface. The narcissist may become increasingly preoccupied with finding a way to regain access to the person who left. They might attempt unexpected contact, seek information through mutual acquaintances, monitor social media activity around the clock, or look for any opportunity to reinsert themselves into that person's life. These efforts are almost always driven by a frantic desire to restore certainty and reduce the stinging discomfort created by the new emotional distance. Because the anger and the desperation feed into one another, the emotional cycle can become much more intense as time goes on. The more unsuccessful their various attempts to regain influence become, the more frustrated they will likely feel, and the more frustrated they feel, the stronger the urge becomes to regain control of the situation. This can lead to rapid, unpredictable shifts between periods of hostility, nostalgia, blame, charm, self-pity, and various attempts at reconciliation. All of these behaviors reflect an ongoing internal struggle to cope with the reality they find nearly impossible to accept. The real crisis is entirely internal, because the deepest challenge for a narcissistic person is often not the loss of a specific relationship, but the forced confrontation with parts of themselves that they have spent years carefully avoiding. Many narcissistic behaviors are specifically designed to shield a fragile sense of self from painful feelings of inadequacy, shame, rejection, or vulnerability. By keeping their focus locked on external metrics like achievement, admiration, social status, control, or constant validation, they can keep these uncomfortable emotions pushed deep into the background. As long as that protective system continues to function, they may rarely feel the need to examine what is actually lying beneath the surface. However, when a significant source of that validation is removed, especially after someone leaves and makes it clear they will not return, that protective structure can begin to weaken significantly. The attention, admiration, emotional investment, or sense of control that once helped them maintain their stability is no longer available. Without those external supports, their uncomfortable emotions may become much harder to ignore. Feelings of deep-seated insecurity, self-doubt, loneliness, inadequacy, or fear can start moving closer to the surface than they have ever been before. What makes this particular crisis so difficult is that it cannot be fully resolved through any external solutions. Finding a new relationship, gaining more attention, achieving professional success, or receiving praise from strangers might provide a temporary distraction, but these things do not address their underlying emotional wounds. The individual may continue searching outside of themselves for the answers they need, while the real source of their distress remains tucked away within.